contextualizing what's going on in the space, in the community we're working with, and then engaging the communities in this work, developing a hazard assessment, and then identifying ultimately, which we'll get to, intervention strategies and implementation guidance. Next slide, please. Part of what we saw is now a developed kind of systematic methodology where the idea is to instrument community members who we work with with research grade equipment that's low cost and highly resolved results, where we're able to collect over 100,000 points in a specific location, and we use those data, clean those data, and move into a series of analytics where we're able to draw in satellite data as well as land characteristics to generate what we call a snapshot in time temperature map. And this is air temperature, not to be confused with satellite derived air temperature. And that is a really big difference, because we're trying to communicate and convey what is the real feel of heat exposure in this particular city block. And that's really at the scale that we're working, is very granular and human level, high resolution outputs. Next slide, please. And part of that work is really to move into, as the video is describing, some outputs that are visually very compelling, that are able to really convey at a way of describing at 10-meter resolution what the air temperature is in a place. We've done this repeated times in several cities and finding very consistent results. And we've published quite a few papers on this at this point. And much of this work moves into social vulnerability assessments, green space identification, identifying which structures and types accelerate or amplify temperatures, as well as getting into longer term housing policies, to name a few outputs that we really, and outcomes that we're really moving towards. Many of these later steps after we collect the data, a lot of communities ask us to conduct workshops and start identifying recommendations. And that's where we've started doing a lot more heat action plans for communities as an outcome from this work. As you all know, we're kind of outsiders in this work, so we really heavily rely on the local folks to kind of lead the conversation, to facilitate, and to lead, and to really shore up the ability for local communities to take action. Next slide, please. Sometimes communities also ask for further analysis of the data. So we take our data, which are very, again, individual points that we're able to identify, and we look at things like green space distribution. Where is their impervious surface? Where is their highly built out industrial areas? Where are their open spaces? And we're able to do this land cover and land use characterization and identify, are there certain attributes on the landscape that are consistently amplifying the temperatures. And this does vary place to place, as we've found. And last slide, please. Bringing us right back to this. The whole goal in this work is really to kind of analyze the data, get to a point where we can facilitate, and then start providing advice. And working with the bank, we've been able to really engage in a number of cities around the world to get folks locally to this place of interventions. What will work here? How will it work? What are the communities how are the communities going to ingest the data? And then what does that mean in terms of identifying potential actions? And so I'll stop there with my piece of the lightning talk and turn it over to Dilip as I close out with the last slide here. Appreciate your attention, and thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Vivek. Really appreciate hearing about all of this. Next, I'd like to introduce Dilip Mavalanka, who is professor at the Indian Institute of Public Health, Gandhinagar, as well as senior consultant with us at the bank. And Dilip will be speaking on the subject of how do city heat action plans save lives. Dilip, over to you.
Thank you very much. It is a proud privilege to be talking to this very elite and august audience. Can I have the next slide? After the very erudite and micro level presentation of Vivek, I'm going to do a very macro level presentation of what really happened in Ahmedabad. Ahmedabad is a city in the west of India, the biggest city in the state of Gujarat and about 5 million population then. 2010 had a major heat wave. As you see in the graph, temperature on the upper red line reached on 21st of May to 47 degrees centigrade. The average temperatures are between 40 to 43 degrees normally. So that was a major heat wave and suddenly came up starting with 19th of May and ending on 27th of May. With this, we looked at the data, next slide please, of the gross mortality of the city. This is all cause gross mortality. The mortality registration in the city is not very good in terms of cause of death. So that's why we look at gross mortality. Given the size of the city, normally there are 100 deaths every day of all causes. But if you see from 19th to 27th of May 2010, the deaths rose to a highest of 310. So in one day of the peak heat, the number of deaths tripled, and the total number of additional deaths as compared to the baseline was almost 800 additional deaths in 1 week. And this was a recent but a very severe heat wave. Next slide, please. Looking at this, when we looked at the registered heat stroke cases in 5 major hospitals, this was done with the local government. I was the director of the School of Public Health and we worked with the local city government. There were only 76 deaths registered as heat stroke deaths in 5 major hospitals, whereas what we found was excess mortality during those times were 800. So that is why this picture of iceberg. So what we see as registered heat stroke deaths in many countries and developing countries is only the tip of the iceberg, only 10%. That's why I again want to emphasize that we must look at all-cause mortality to figure out what is the impact of heat waves. Next slide, please. We also looked at the 15-year data from the past in the summer, and this is a scatter plot of daily mortality on the vertical axis and daily maximum temperature on the horizontal axis. And you see that at around 41 degrees, the graph starts going up. It goes up at 43 degrees faster and 45 degrees even faster. And that is where for a practical heat action plan threshold, we decided 41 degrees maximum temperature as yellow alert, 43 degrees as orange alert, and 45 degrees upwards as red alert. Using this simple traffic light, we developed a heat action plan along with the city of Ahmedabad and the international partners, NRDC, which is an American NGO which supported this. The heat action plan had 4 basic components: a early warning system and interagency emergency response plan, a public awareness and community outreach, capacity building of medical professionals, because we realized that the medical professionals were not managing the heat stroke cases well in the 2010 heat wave, and reducing heat exposure and promoting adaptive measures. Next slide, please. We look at these components one after another. This is the early warning system. So the India Meteorology Department, which is the Indian Weather Service, provides the city 5-day advance maximum and minimum temperature warnings. And this warning, based on the cutoffs which I just described, is then interpreted and communicated by the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation Nodal Officer for Health. He is a deputy health officer given additional responsibility for heat wave management. And he then alerts the press and media people, also the state government and various departments of the government and various utilities, so as to respond to the impending heat waves almost 3 to 5 days in advance. And the heat action plan describes what each agency will do in detail. Next slide, please. The second intervention is public awareness and community outreach. When we looked at this data and death of 800 people, we realized that many people in very hot countries believe that they are all used to heat, and heat mortalities, only very few people will die. So we had series of posters, public awareness campaigns, meetings with slum and low income communities to make them aware of how heat kills, how to protect, what actions to take when different alerts are announced, and how the heat action plan will be implemented. So this is how the community awareness and media played a very large role. They helped us, the TV, print media, and now social media, to communicate the alert whenever it is sounded. Next slide, please. The third intervention was building capacity of health staff. So we held with the municipal corporation and the local medical college a series of orientation workshops for medical officers of the urban health centers, the hospitals, and the referral centers, how to diagnose and manage heat emergency and what preparations to do in terms of setting up heat wards, setting up ORS corners in urban health centers, and having ambulances with cooling equipment like ice packs during the summer. So these simple things were done to build up the capacity of the health system. Next slide, please. The last intervention was reducing heat exposure and promoting adaptive measures. So painting roofs white, which is what is called as cool roof, providing free cold water for drinking at 700 places in the city, planting more trees, and developing some measures of developing cooling centers where these, besides awareness. So this was the main four actions which were done by the city. Next slide, please. When we looked at the impact of this after 3 years of implementation, what we saw was that the risk of mortality substantially reduced beyond 44 degrees centigrade. And a preliminary assessment uh, done showed that almost 1,200 annualized deaths were saved in the whole summer each year following the heat action plan. So this shows how a simple heat action plan in a low resource setting can work to prevent heat-related mortality. And we have then validated this in the following heat-related events in the city, as well as this plan has been implemented in many places through the National Disaster Management Authority of India. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilip, for sharing the very inspiring and instructive example from Ahmedabad. Our third speaker will be Zhuman Wang, Senior Urban Specialist at the bank. Zhuman, over to you, please, for your lightning talk on the topic, how does greening and urban design make a cooler city?
Thank you, Nick. Perhaps just to give everybody a bit background. Back a few years ago, the World Bank ISMAP and the Global Platform for Sustainable Cities issue a report about how to leverage passive solutions to deal with urban heat. So after passive solutions, many related to the material, using material like paving. As a previous speaker just mentioned, the white wall, the white roofing, and also the nature-based solutions. So after that study, we decided to do some pilot activities to see that how some of the ideas and practice can be translated to actually into a city's planning process, as well as some of the core activities that normally would be done by the World Bank, by the others, such as urban regeneration and new town development. Next. So we work with the city of Guangzhou, a big background. So it's a mega city, 18 million people, and with the population basically increase on the annual basis, 600,000 people moving to the city. And not a surprise that the urban core is the central part of the urban heat, as exactly as what has been presented before. The first thing we did is to understand or build the urban heat map, and the data we collected largely from the meteorological agencies, both air temperature as well as ground temperature. So it has been quite accurate. evaluate and to understand where exactly the urban heat take place. And that's, one thing you see that is the map of the city. It's all in the urban core, and the average density of that part is almost 40,000 per square meter. So it's very densely populated and very little vegetarian, and also tend to be low income families as well. Next. So what we did like 3 levels, as I just mentioned, let's put it as a macro level, and to look at how the spatial planning can help to reduce the urban heat. So one very important, as I made this presentation a number of times in different contexts, and one thing I found that the wind corridors have been consistently ignored by many. It's quite important to understand where wind comes from and what's the corridor, because the wind plays a very important role to cool the cities. And most of our cities, in part the modern cities, build up the high-rise building, built up in the way that effectively actually blocks the wind corridors. And so understand where wind comes from and the corridor is quite important in terms of land use planning, and also to decide where to build all those high-rise and from housing and office buildings. So that's the first part, and the 6 major the air corridors. At the same time, also actually they have many sub-corridors. So this just gives you an overall snapshot. And another part is the ecological planning. So one is important, later you'll see that we look at the green space and water facilities, but really to cool down the city, very important is that to look cities as a whole, in the sense that how the green areas and the water facilities can cool down the city. To do that is absolutely critical to understand that how plan the city as a whole. Most cities have the green master plans, but it's important also when cities do that green master plan to incorporate that consideration about the cooling impact and effects. So next. So the mapping, of course, the city of Guangzhou has done an excellent job about their green master planning to see that where the major ecological areas and also the ecological corridors and the green cores, and that actually gives the implication that to what extent all those areas that can cool down the temperature. As we also know that it has been proved statistically that the rural area in general, the temperature could be 5 or 6 Celsius degrees lower than the urban core. The next. So that so to do that, we also need to we also look into one particular wetland, which the city of Guangzhou very fortunate to keep that wetland instead of converting into the buildings or the roads. And this hydro wetland is a large 11 square kilometers located in the city core, and to understand how this wetland actually play a role in cooling down the city. So we did 4 types of services: urban cooling effects, health benefits, carbon sequestration, and recreation. Of course, that modeling work also generate what would be the economic value of this of the wetland. But more important, also to assess the cooling impact and how from the one wetland also link into other green areas that could provide the overall cooling impact to the city. The next. So that's the overall and the macro level spatial planning. Then we look at our core urban business that we do a lot of old town urban regeneration. And as I mentioned, that those areas tend to be the poor areas and very densely populated. And to say that what kind of measures that can be incorporated into urban regeneration, we're not talking about new buildings, it's really built up to use the existing measures to apply the measures to the existing buildings. The next one. So that's also the overall the strategies that have been developed. So at the 3 levels, and first is at the building level. What can be done individual buildings? Look at the roofing, look at the windows, look at the basically the surface, the wall, and how that what kind the green roofing and painting how this can be applied to the individual buildings. That's one. And then we look at the site level, and again here we actually also look at the ventilation, because that's quite important. You may have heard the cool alleys, that how also somehow whether there's a possibility to redevelop the street level that could bring the air into the street. And of course, And then the third part is very important, landscape, right? So how you bring that green vegetation and some different measures into the particular site when they are doing the urban regeneration. So this just gives you the overall and what has been developed and what has been proposed. Next. And the third part that what we do, of course, as I mentioned, that 600,000 people on the annual basis to move to cities. They are also looking into the new town development. And that's where, again, that actually because of our interventions, a lot of designs have been remade. One important, again, I really would like to emphasize again is the ventilation. And it's quite important to understand how the new buildings will not block the wind corridors. And another important thing is that the solar radiation, because other buildings, you have the windows, you have the glasses, and also materials used actually generate a quite large amount of the solar radiation. Really, that's where urban heat island effects. And when they build a new city, to what extent the materials can be utilized, introduced into the new buildings. And one of the major challenges, of course, is the when a lot of material, when you do piloting is good, but how to apply in an economic scale, because it's sometimes quite difficult to identify and source the material that would be useful for the cool buildings. Yeah. Let me just go to the last one. This one. So so I have a lot of key messages, but let me summarize into 3. How we build a cool, breathable cities. I like the word not only cool, the city also not only, you need to let the city breathe, and you need to introduce the air into the city. So first, exactly as I've been presented, that we need to have the heat map. That gives you a very important foundation to understand the location and the solutions. And the second, so the spatial planning is quite important. That also requires raising awareness. A lot of urban planners now, they start to introduce climate mitigation into their the spatial planning, but the consideration of cooling and not yet into most people's mind. This has been our experience. So I think raise awareness and then also understand that how those elements can be incorporated into their own land use and master planning. And again, don't forget wind corridors, and that have been consistently ignored by many. And the third part, of course, we have a lot of you will see that there are a lot of good guidelines and the reports that have been produced. And one important part eventually to make that happen, as it comes down to the building codes and the area standard, and that's quite important to incorporate into all those codes and standards to make that happen. So thank you.
Thank you, Shuman. Thanks a lot for sharing the experience from Guangzhou, which I think has really been one of the absolute key pathfinders on this area within the bank. And your presentation also happens to be, I think, a perfect segue into what Gerald is going to present. You talk about developing a heat map as a foundation for assessing suitable solutions. Our fourth speaker is going to be Gerald Mills, who is a professor at University College Dublin. I'm also going to give a plug for going to Amazon and finding a copy of the book that Gerald and 3 co-authors have written called Urban Climates, which is really the reference book on how the physical form of cities influences the weather and the climate in those cities, and topics like developing a heat map are certainly addressed in a lot of depth in that book. Gerald is going to talk on how do data and models drive effective heat action. Gerald, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, and thanks for 3 excellent talks. So I hope that I don't talk across anybody, because I will present something that's actually quite general in some respects, but I think it fits very closely to what the other speakers have presented. So practically every one of my slides are images. So the image on the left-hand side and the image on the right-hand side basically describes the types of spaces inside cities, which are fundamentally either indoor spaces or outdoor spaces. The indoor space is usually extremely strongly controlled. This image is from a building in Sao Paulo, which given its latitude, given the amount of energy it gets, has a problem. It has to get rid of energy. So the way it gets rid of energy is it actually sheds it off the building envelope. Now, it happened to use a pink facade, so that means it actually paints all the areas around it in terms of the color of the fabric itself. So I think one of the issues we have to face, certainly in wealthy cities and in emerging cities where these types of buildings are ever present, is the extent to which individual personalized spaces of comfort inside the city can lead to outdoor spaces that are quite uncomfortable. On the right-hand side is a nice piece of design that I just took an image of from Sardinia. It's obviously a hot climate. This is a space where people wait, so they have outdoor shading. So these are two spaces I think that we need to think about when we talk about the city and when we talk about the urban heat island. We have been talking about the outdoor space, but the indoor space is critical, especially given how much time people spend in that indoor space. And this goes to the heart about the urban heat island itself. And sorry, next slide, please. And essentially what it is. And I would just like to reiterate something that was made in the first presentation, is that there are several types of urban heat island. And that means they come along with different ways by which you observe them. One type is based upon air temperature. The other is based upon surface temperature. Now, practically, nobody measures all the surface temperatures. What we do instead is we get these synoptic images taken from a satellite, which shows us the excessive warning inside the city compared to outside. But they are two different types of heat islands. The one on the right-hand side, which is a surface heat island, is extremely heterogeneous. It depends entirely on microscale decisions about the locations of buildings, where shading patterns are, where green spaces are. So the temperatures you're looking at here, you might regard them as sticky. They're stuck to those surfaces. Now, if I make decisions based upon the surface temperature of the heat island, particularly in the city centre, recognize that I'm talking about often the rooftops of buildings. In other words, whatever interventions I do will affect that building, but will not necessarily affect the outdoor space. The one on the left-hand side is what's known as the canopy level urban heat island. This is the heat island measured at the level of your chest, in between buildings. It is the classic urban heat island and has been measured for more than 200 years. So 200 years, think about it. That means we must know a great deal about what causes it and how it comes about. The image above, which comes from this book on urban climates, is essentially to distinguish between the nighttime, which is the picture on the left-hand side, and the daytime, which is the picture on the right-hand side, heat islands. So think about your interventions based upon what you're trying to resolve. Trying to fix the air temperature heat island is much more difficult than trying to fix the surface heat island. Next slide, please. So we do know what caused the urban heat island. And in fact, if I had a map of a city and I had certain information in there, such as, for example, first and foremost, the extent of impervious land cover. Second of all, what are the nature of the construction materials? Third of all, what are the nature of the buildings and how closely spaced they are? And if I knew something about the anthropogenic heat, which is generated by people and by their activities like buildings, like roads, industry, etc., I can pretty much tell you where the heat island is going to be strongest. So I think identifying the magnitude of the urban heat island is relatively easy to do. In other words, I can put all this information into models, and there's many models that now exist that are quite capable of determining where the urban heat island is going to be strongest, the surface and the air temperature urban heat island, using information gathered across the city. So the first thing I would say to anybody who's interested in mapping the urban heat island is to put together geographic databases which cover these types of material. Now, some of this is actually relatively easy to get. For example, there are global databases of impervious land cover. There is information which can be directly observed on construction fabric. More difficult to get is the 3D geometry, but you don't need it to be extremely precise. And you can use information on traffic, etc., to get at the anthropogenic heat. So you might wonder then, why do we need to study the urban heat island continuously, given that we've known about it for 200 years? One is, I think clearly that the urban heat island studies that have been done in the past have largely focused in developed world cities, and they've not really focused on emerging world cities, particularly very poor parts of emerging cities. Second of all, it's interesting to study the urban heat island from a developed or wealthy city, simply because we know that about 40% of all the energy on the planet is used to create indoor building climates. And because we know that trying to regulate the urban heat island goes to some extent to the regulation of the indoor climate. Now, next slide, please. So this is how I talk about urban heat island risk with my students. This comes from a book that I would have done with Ian Stewart and myself, and the book is free. It's a guideline as to how to do an urban heat island study. So we know a great deal, I think, about the nature of the hazard. But what we often don't know about the city is the levels of exposure and the degrees of vulnerability. And these are the critical parts that determine risk. In other words, using satellites to map out the urban heat island might give you a good sense of where the magnitude is strongest, but that's not to say that's where the biggest risk is located. Here's the other thing about the urban heat island. You need to place the urban heat island within the context of the background climate. So the title of this talk is Cool Cities. I come from Dublin, which is located in Ireland. It is a cool city to start with. In other words, I can make a reasonable argument for the urban heat island to be a good thing inside the city. So then why would I study the urban heat island in a place like Dublin? Well, I would say that mapping the urban heat island also tells you about all those things that we want to know about city climates. So for example, where you get the urban heat island strongest, that's also where you're going to have a pluvial flood problem because the landscape is hard and it will not take up water. It's also a place that's going to be extremely diminished in terms of biodiversity and in terms of providing green spaces. So I could study the urban heat island merely as a diagnostic, a very, very simple means to determine what is the nature of the urban effect. Now, when I address the issue of how to cope with the risk, this is where I do think we need to talk seriously about exposure, where the people are, which varies by time of the day, and vulnerability, which has got to do with the spaces that people occupy. Next slide, please. So I think these are the spaces we need to consider completely. There is an indoor space, which in wealthy parts of the world can be completely conditioned. In fact, one of the problems we have with global warming is that the spaces are completely conditioned and are not fitted to the climates which they're located, which means we spend a lot of energy in creating an indoor space which is completely fixed without regard to the outdoor space. And then we have to take into account the individual themselves, the decision maker, and their degrees of freedom to make use of the indoor and the outdoor spaces. So a critical thing at the outset is to decide upon what is the nature of the urban heat island that you're examining and how you would seek to address it. For example, if I'm interested in the outdoor space, the space which I call the zone of human occupation, it consists of the indoor spaces which are enclosed and the outdoor spaces which are partially open. And those outdoor spaces, by the way, I can tell you straight off, if you have an urban heat island, the area where the greatest urban heat island magnitude is going to be strongest is almost certainly the place where the air quality is going to be worst. It's almost certainly the place, as I say, which is hardest and which is devoid of vegetation. So when I paint the rooftop of a building, it doesn't really have a great deal of impact on what's happening inside the canopy, but what it does do is it affects the indoor space. So when we think about the types of actions to take place, I think we should do it within the context of what is the nature of the microscale environment we're trying to address. Next slide, please. And this comes to an issue that was identified by our Indian speaker, is that we actually have very, very good systems, very good science to tell us that there's going to be a heat wave event. And here's an example. This is from Europe in 2022. The event was forecast at least 3 weeks in advance. In other words, what we're doing is we're talking about adapting to this event here. Now, that adaptation can occur in the form of actually physical change to the city, as our speaker says, ventilation corridors, changing the fabric of the city, etc., etc. Or we can actually build in degrees of freedom to the population that occupies the city. In other words, we can use all those warning systems that our speaker spoke about. And I'll finish with this slide here. You would not think of London as necessarily being a place where they have a heat problem, but it turns out they do, and it's becoming more frequent. This was the first study that any urban heat island study was ever done in. And if you look at those studies, they all say all the things that were bad about urbanization, with the exception of the heat island. And the reason I said it was good for the City of London is because it provided warmth during the winter months. If I look at the modern day city, which is now constructed completely differently, in which the buildings are now completely isolated, the urban heat island has become problematic. So the way you would take care of it is you either condition buildings on the right-hand side, or you create outdoor spaces that people can avail of. But it only works, of course, if the people have these spaces adjacent or nearby to where they live. So the picture I've shown you below is in fact an image that they have for the City of London, which identifies all these cool spots inside the city. So we heard about the wind corridors, which you can see the cool spot is all along the River Thames, and then individual buildings located throughout the city that represent either big physical buildings like libraries, etc., or buildings that are air conditioned. I think we know a great deal about the urban heat island. I think it's a first step is certainly to identify where the magnitude is strongest, but the critical thing I think is to identify exposure and vulnerability. And I think we have the models to do the science, but what we're missing often is the data to apply that science reasonably in given areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. For that very stimulating talk. I'm going to hand straight on to Mark Roberts, our lead urban economist, for his reflections on what we have heard from the speakers. Mark, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Nicholas, and I'll try to keep this relatively brief. But thank you first of all to Nick to taking the initiative to organise this series. Thank you too for excellent speakers. I mean, I really learned a lot from each of the presentations. I must say, I live in Cairo, and so the temperature today here in Cairo is 41 degrees Celsius. I can see on my computer at the moment. And so this makes the topic very personal to me indeed. Earlier today, my iPhone shut down when I was outside because it overheated. I think these baking conditions in Cairo, in all the developing country cities in particular, also help make the point that urban heat is not just a future problem, it's also very much a current problem for many cities around the world that requires quite urgent action. So Nick asked me to give brief reflections under the title Towards a Bank Action Agenda on Extreme Heat. So that's quite an ambitious title with a few minutes to address. So rather than doing that necessarily, I want to draw on the presentations, at least surface a few extra questions that I've been thinking about that I hope this series can shed light on. And so doing so, take us closer to such an agenda. So the first question concerns this issue of urban heat and welfare inequalities within cities. I think both Vivek's and Gerald's presentations made a strong case that heat exposure differs widely across city landscapes. Vivek showed the map of Bandung from our own work, which in Bandung we found a 7 degrees Celsius difference in temperatures across neighborhoods, with poorer neighborhoods being systematically hotter. But that's not the end of the story. While in Bandung, while in many other cities that have been studied, including Cape Town, as we saw, the poorest neighborhoods have been found to be the hottest. This isn't the case for all cities. So, for example, in Bangkok, I've seen a study that shows that actually it's the city's richest neighborhoods that are the hottest. However, while we have these different relationships between temperature and poverty across neighborhoods within cities, positive in a majority of cases, but in some other cases actually negative, isn't very well understood, at least from my understanding of the literature, although I am relatively new to the literature. So understanding who is exposed and vulnerable to extreme urban heat will be really crucial in designing effective and targeted responses. And so it's critical that we address these knowledge gaps, particularly for developing country cities, on thermal inequalities and the relationship with poverty. And so this brings me to my second question. I mean, as I think shown by Dilep, many cities such as Ahmedabad have been developing these heat action plans. And these heat action plans can contain very diverse measures, from tree planting to wind corridors to cooling centres to early warning systems and so forth. But it would be helpful to know, however, which interventions have the highest benefit-cost ratios in different contexts. So, for example, the benefit-cost ratio of tree planting in a city like Cairo, which is really struggling with water scarcity, given the climate as well. It's probably very different to that in a city in a more temperate country. And so also related to that, it would be helpful to know more about the potential trade-offs associated with different interventions. So for example, while interventions that make a poor neighborhood cooler, I mean, that seems very obviously desirable. But there's also a risk. There's a risk that if we succeed in cooling down the neighborhood, making it much more pleasant to live, then that could lead to gentrification of that neighborhood. We might push out the poor to neighborhoods that are perhaps less desirable in other ways, less attractive. To the extent that the housing in those neighborhoods is rental housing, it's also possible that welfare benefits of the interventions ultimately go to the landlords, that potentially absentee landlords, rather than the poor tenants who live there. And so in such a context, maybe a better long-term solution might be a less immediately obvious solution. Maybe one solution would be to provide more affordable housing in parts of the city that are already cooler. And so I think, thinking about some of these potential trade-offs, unintended consequences, is an interesting topic. A third related question is whether there are any tools and methodologies that we in the bank should adopt and or encourage the development of to better serve our clients. So Schumann gave an inspiring example of piloting passive design features, developing ventilation corridors. Gerald and Vivek showcased methods to measure, model, predict heat risk within cities. I think the forthcoming seminars in this series will likely surface a wide range of potentially valuable methodologies and data sources, as well as potential gaps where we might need more research. And the fourth question, which is my final question, which is really, I think, the million-dollar question for us in the bank, is how can we leverage the bank's financing instruments to help our clients tackle extreme heat? And so we do currently have a portfolio review that we're conducting, and this has shown that already dozens of recent projects have funded investments that have relevance for urban heat reduction. But we've got some way to go before lending operations, and the results frameworks for those operations are specifically designed around heat stress. And so this is an area that we need to think about more, we need to be able to develop. Okay, so let me leave it there. I mean, it's really heartening to see such excellent participation for this event, and I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion as this Cool Cities Coffee series proceeds. Thank you, Nick. Back over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And we are 2 minutes to the hour with one slide left. The slide in particular is just to give a indication of the topics that we are planning to cover in the upcoming monthly online sessions that we have together. In particular, a heads up for the first full session of this series, which is planned for next month, in partnership with the Global Programme for Nature-Based Solutions. Thanks to Boris and Brendan and their team for getting that one lined up with us. We have, I think, a really exciting agenda focused on how urban nature-based solutions, various aspects of urban greening, can practically work to promote a cooler city. And I think we have some really good implementation experiences, but also modeling and analysis tools to bring into that conversation. Looking ahead, we actually have a much longer list of topics that we would be, I think, keen to tackle. We're also really keen just to hear from people about what they want to do in the series. We wanted to have a more in-depth look, picking up on some of the tools that Gerald and Vivek showed on how we can use data and models to target heat action. We wanted to bring in some of the experiences from chief heat officers and others playing a similar role on talking through those experiences of how some of the leading city level strategic plans on heat resilience have been developed. We wanted to look in depth at the topic of urban transport and heat waves, and look also at climate sensitive urban designs. So I will leave it there. We have Q&A on the agenda. If anybody would like to pop in a quick question, I think it'd be nice to close on time. So maybe just if anybody would like to stick a hand up quickly, and we can do one or two. Otherwise, if there are no immediate ones, we can park Q&A for the whole series of upcoming sessions. So let me just leave the floor open for a quick minute to see if anybody would like to put in one question. I'm going to take it that that means that everybody has absorbed the maximum of interesting material for the moment, and people are shy to be the first one to jump in. So I think we've absorbed an awful lot from our speakers today, and we will have plenty of time in upcoming months to really dig into these details following that taster. So on that basis, I would just like to thank our participants today. I'd like to say thanks for joining us. Thanks very much to Bernice for joining to kick us off, to our speakers, Vivek, Dilip, Juman, and Gerald, and to Mark for his wonderful reflections. I'm seeing a hand that's gone up and then come back down again.
It's meant to be a clap. Apologies.
Oh, it's meant to be a clap. Okay, wonderful. In that case, the series is organized jointly by GFDRR, City Resilience Program, the Urban and Spatial Analytics GSG, and the Cities and Climate Change GSG. Please do get in touch with myself, Chandan, or Nuala if you have some suggestions for upcoming events. And thank you very much for joining. See you next time.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everyone.